Welcome everyone for day 3 conference. Good morning, Dr. Sanjay.
Good morning. Yeah, so good morning, everybody. Welcome again back to our third day of IEEE Cloud Computing for Emerging Markets conference. So today, Rambabu Pravartina from IBM Singapore and myself, Dr. Sanjay Chitnis from Dayanand Sagar University, Bangalore, will be the session chairs. So we have three interesting parts for this today's session. We start with a very interesting tutorial on Couchbase. Rambabu Pravartina will be actually telling more about that. Then we'll have paper presentations and finally followed by a keynote. Okay. So let's start. I'll over to Rambabu.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjay Chitnis. Warm welcome to day 3 of IEEE International Conference on Cloud Computing in Emerging Markets, the virtual event. Coming to a keynote topic today, as we all know, the data is the key to the survival of the organization in the competitive world. The data has become the newest natural resource. Without data, there is no AI. To make the newer initiatives like AI and deploying the modern applications successfully in the organizations, we have to get the data architecture right and choose the right data product depending upon the requirements, right? Hence, understanding the nature of data is a key to drive the newer initiatives in the organization. So today we have distinguished speaker, Sriram Melkot from Couchbase, Bangalore, India, to talk about the nature of data. Sriram Melkot is a data practitioner and innovator. He worked in various leadership roles at Couchbase and Oracle. In recent years, Sriram is focused on layer consolidating logic and the data storage. Sriram holds a master's degree from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And with that introduction, over to Sriram to start the keynote session. Sriram, over to you.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction and very warm welcome to the session today. Let me share my screen. Please give me a moment. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see.
Awesome. So today I had so when I was asked to give a talk, I started thinking about what do I have knowledge about. And I realized that since I have spent like 15 years looking at data in various forms in different companies and different facets of it, I thought it would be interesting to point out some obvious things about data. Because data is all around us, we don't think about it much. You know, it's like air or it's like water, very essential, but it is because it is so prevalent everywhere. We don't often think about it and we don't often ask about what is it that constitutes data. So in today's session, I am going to ask a series of questions and make some common sense observations and try to speculate what it's pointing us to. So, it's kind of a session where I encourage you to reflect and think and try to basically project out into the future years. So one of the things that was very important in my academic days in college was this book. It says algorithms plus data structures equal to programs. Probably 25 years ago, I saw this book and it's still burnt in my mind because Nicholas Wirth in 1976, he hit upon this formula as to what does it mean to do computation. So today there's a lot of discussions about cloud computation. There's a lot of focus on cloud. The focus that I want to bring in today is the one on computation. And specifically, computation involves two elements, the algorithms, the programmatic elements, and the data structures, the structures that hold data. And therein comes data. So when you look at cloud computing, data is very fundamental to it. And data is the long-lived, it's the state of the cloud. And understanding this has very important repercussions to cloud computing and how it evolves over the next many years. So moving on, I wanted to ask the question, what is data? See, if you ask somebody in academics, if you ask your professor, a likely answer you may get is that data is tuples. It's basically a collection of quantified numbers. And this was how things like relational algebra developed. It's very interesting because you can operate on it and you can apply well-known mathematical principles to manipulate it. Now moving little bit to the actual applied industry. If I went to a bank and asked them what is data, what does data mean to a bank? They'll say it's rows and columns, tables, rows, columns, keys, ledgers. So to them, it is tabular data, like spreadsheets. Now, if I move further and I ask somebody in database industry, like myself, what is data? The primary concept that I work with is documents and relations. So we have objects that have certain types of information and structure, and the relationships between these. So whenever you talk of databases, this is the prevalent notion of it. A time not too long ago was when people did look at data as spreadsheets, and there were products that modeled data as spreadsheets that were databases. But we have now come to this steady state where we look at data as documents and relations. But if I move further and ask somebody who is in human sciences, like a doctor or an artist, what is data to them, right? A very perceptive answer I once got is that data is a quantification of perception. What this means is that we have data all around us. It's infinite. Now, when these facts become data is when you capture them. So in other words, data is not facts. Facts are infinite and they're flowing and they're a continuum. Facts become data when you capture them. So data is the exercise of capturing facts. It's a very interesting perception because it's the most generic of the lot and it applies to a vast variety of data. Now moving on, let's look at some traits of data. So one obvious trait is the family of data. See, we have tables, we have images, we have video, we have time series. So we have different types of families of data which are very easily perceivable. Then we have relationships. If I have two objects and one is a parent, the other is a child, or if I have objects representing various members of a family, there are relationships between documents, which is another trait of data. Data is not standalone, it has a relationship. And then there are operations. I can, for example, rotate an image. It makes a lot of sense. But I can't rotate a bank balance. That doesn't make sense. So that again goes to define another trait of data. What kind of operations are applicable to data? Another very interesting trait of data is the scope of it. So if I look at some information, a fact, like the speed of light in vacuum, or the distance between Earth and Sun, these are global scope data. What I mean is that regardless of who observes this fact, the result is the same. The estimation of the fact may continually improve, but it is well understood that the underlying fact that people are observing is the same, and there's consensus on what it is. Now, interestingly, there's another class of data called observer scope data. It's a philosophy from a long time ago. It basically asks the question, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around, did it make a sound? It's a very obvious thing, but it's very interesting line of thought, because what it says is that does the fact happen because there's an observer? There's a very interesting talk yesterday on quantum mechanics, and in quantum sciences, this is just not a philosophy. This is how things work. So in other words, The observer makes the fact appear. Now, it turns out that this is a very interesting aspect of databases, and a tree falling when nobody is there, not making a sound or a sound. The important concept for data is the relevance of data, or the lack of relevance for data which is not observed. Another trait of data, global versus observed scope. Now, let's quickly see how databases have evolved. So, databases started off as algebras. This is the mathematical foundations. Things such as Codd's paper in the 1970s, these set the founding basis for relational algebra. Then we went on to applied databases. We had relational databases that brought in concepts as schemas, relationships, and tables, foreign keys, parent-child, normalization. So this was the 1990s, and it had an enormous impact. So once you took the algebra and you made it into a product, it started capturing very highly valuable information. Banks, what used to be ledgers and big books, suddenly became pieces of electronic data. In fact, people even talk about closing books today, but almost no business uses a book to maintain their accounting. So it was a fundamental shift. And then in 2020s, we started talking about document databases. So if you look at the current era of NoSQL databases, distinguishing characteristic about them is that they use documents. And documents are objects that contain a structure and they put a boundary around it, and they don't do unnecessary denormalization. So with tables, you took the structure came first, and you basically morph the data through process of normalization to fit it. But with document data, you try to keep the natural structure of the data and hold it as a singular object. So different approaches, similar end results, but the trade-offs different, result in different flexibilities. Now let's look at how database operations have evolved. So if I look at the class of databases we have today, there's ACID databases. You know, ACID is atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. These are the fundamental pillars of what we consider a relational database today. So ACID databases have an interesting characteristic that they have absolute knowledge of data. In other words, in an ACID database, if you insert a fact, if you insert a piece of data, the presence of it is absolute. Every part of the database knows it exists and acknowledges and operates consistent with the data that you have put into the database. They also have the concept of ordering. They have the concept of what happened first, what observed, and what came next. Now, it's typically a acyclic, directed acyclic graph, but an ordering does exist. So in other words, some notion of causality is maintained. So this has been the fundamental tenet. Last 20 years, the shift of information from physical world into electronic world has been fueled by ACID databases. They've had an enormous impact. But the downside of it is that you have to make a choice. ACID databases are either slow or they're expensive. So in other words, ACID databases rely on having a shared source of truth. And you can make it fast by having fast disks and very fast interconnects, but that makes it expensive. Or you could choose to put it on fewer nodes or even a single node, which makes them slow. So the ACID guarantees impose a definite penalty on cost versus performance, the cost performance trade-offs. Then we have the new class of databases called sharded databases. Couchbase is a good example. These databases manufacture consistency based on the observer. So if you go back to the previous two things I said, the global scope and the observed scope, these roughly correspond to ACID databases and the observer consistency databases. Basically, in these sharded databases, consistency does not exist as a fundamental element. I can observe two documents, and I may see them in particular order, or I may see data exchange between the two in a specific order. So the consistency is in the eyes of the viewer. It's not a fundamental aspect that gets captured. And This level of consistency, or the way of doing consistency, allows for linear scalability. So imagine you had to think about the entire world, not even the entire world. Imagine you had to keep track of everything happening in your building. It would be an enormous overload on your brain. Keeping track of all the facts happening in your building currently gives you this omnipotent knowledge, right? You know everything that's happening in the building, but it takes over your entire brain. It's very expensive to process, and bulk of the facts that you ingest are not useful. That's ACID databases for an analogy of it. Now, if you look at a sharded database, it's typically how we operate. See, you are in this room, you are listening to this talk. Those are the facts that you are focusing on. Now, in 2 floors below, let's say that somebody is walking around, or somebody closed a window and you heard the sound of the window being closed. Even though you may sense it, you don't observe it. So now if I ask you the question, did the presentation end first or did the window close next? The answer is most of us don't know, because it was an irrelevant fact. And even though we might have sensed both of them, we didn't preserve the ordering, or we didn't preserve the facets of the fact. If I ask you the question, did a window close? You may have an answer, but you may not be able to correlate with everything else that happened. So this is sharded databases. And these basically bring consistency at the viewpoint of observers. They offer linear scalability. So you can add more nodes to your database cluster and get a linear speed up in performance. They're fast and cheap. But you sacrifice this omnipotent correctness that ACID databases bring. So it's a very interesting evolution. When ACID databases came in, it was the ultimate, right? This is exactly what we wanted, and it gave a lot of theoretical strong guarantees. The fact that we'd go to sharded databases was something that people didn't expect. But this transition happened because this is how data works. So the observation, there's a lot of research done on relational databases, but they did not bring up the fact that sharded databases could exist with observer consistency and other weaker guarantees, but give us significant performance benefit doing so. And this transition happened because this is the nature of data. So the important point I'm trying to emphasize is that even though data has been around with us for a very long time, and for at least 50 years, we have been observing data as a specific aspect of computer science, there are fundamental aspects of it that is visible to all of us that are going to impact how we look at data and store it. And we are still discovering it. So it's a very interesting area, very fundamental. There are a lot of basics, but it's an area that's in rapid evolution. And the NoSQL database movement that happened in the last 10, 15 years is an excellent example of what is to come. So now let's look at the tools of our trade. For people to be effective, tools are a very key element of it. And the tools of data that we have today are things like schemas. Our first normal form, second normal form, tables, schemas, collection of schemas, and so on and so forth. We have SQL. SQL is a very powerful language that has tried to tell how we describe data and how we operate with it. It has been around for 30 years and still continues to be very strong, which is a testament to its appropriateness. A lot of tools come and go, but the tools that stay with us are the ones that capture some fundamental aspect of the operation of data. And SQL is one of them, a very lasting language. It's a domain-specific language. It has been built to deal with data. And it has been around with us for a long time, which emphasizes the importance of it. We have the concept of ACID, and we have the CAP theorem that fundamentally limits what you can do in a cluster. But these are coarse-grained tools. See, for me, now I need to operate with a microprocessor. The tools I have are a hacksaw and a hammer. Hacksaw and hammers are very useful, but these tools are not what prepares me for my current generation. So what is happening today? We have an explosion of data. See, we have small processors. 20 years ago, I might have had one processor in a house. Today, without even knowing it, I'll have 10, 20, 30 processors, small devices that use very low power, but have significant computational capacities. And they have connectivity. They have connectivity to the cloud, so they can work with a centralized coordinator, centralized repository of data. And we have thousands of them. These devices cost few hundred rupees, 300 rupees, 500 rupees. But they bring a full 32-bit processor and significant amount of RAM. And they're exploding. And the data that they generate is exploding exponentially. We have visual and oral data. Just a little while ago, taking a photograph or making a videotape was something that you did on occasion. You did that if there's a marriage, for example. I remember watching a lot of videotapes at marriages. But it was something that you did on a special occasion. But today, if you look at it, you are capturing visual and audio information 24/7 and in thousands of locations. Basically, the amount of visual and audio data that you capture has gone up by many orders of magnitude. There are other interesting aspects such as genetic data, which is very fundamental to our very existence, which is also significant in volume, that is now being increasingly captured at population scale. And we have a number of other things like spatial data. Unless you actively took actions to do so, your collection of phones over the last 10 years will tell you everywhere you have been in the last 10 years. Now, no human will remember that, right? Maybe a very gifted human, but the average person will not remember every place they have been to in the last 10 years. But this data is available in the cloud. It gives you a level of perspective that didn't exist before. So going back to the humanist-centric view of data, if I define data as capturing facts that exist around me, we are capturing a lot more facts today than we did last year and we did the year before, and so on and so forth. And there's an explosion of data. A lot of this data is ending up in the cloud, but the tools we have are very primitive. These are the tools from the past generation. They are not relevant to the data that we are capturing today. If I ask, what is the schema of a video? There is a schema, but it's very uninteresting. It represents a mechanical aspect of it. There is no schema in the real world, right? You cannot predict what will appear in a random video. But the tools of data that we use today require us to describe a schema, without which they are not effective anymore. So here is what I think of data when I look at it, right? We have enormous amounts of data. They're all very interesting, but we have piled it up. And the way we have collected it, the way we have organized it, while we have captured it, it is there and it's available, and you can potentially go pull out an interesting piece of information. It is very expensive to find it, and you would do it only in a circumstance where the data is of very high value. So this is our state of data today. We are capturing increasingly larger amounts of data. Cloud has evolved to the point where it is feasible both technologically and economically to capture large amounts of data. It is happening, but we don't have the organization or tools to make it work well. So the brave new world is going to come out, folks. The data that I'm talking about, that's today, this has to change. And to change, we need things like a new domain-specific language. So if I go back and look at the various types of data we are capturing today, the temperature sensors, the visual and audio data, the genetic data, the spatial data, each of them have their own language. With IoTs, you may have a time series database. With visual, you have specialized tools to do visual image recognition. You have genetic databases, which are a category of their own. And you have geospatial databases. But each of them has its own specific language. And while SQL may connect them all, SQL does not inherently embed the basic operations of data. See, as I told you at the beginning, One is the shape of data, but the operations you can do in it is an equally important aspect of it. So if I look at visual data like video, a fundamental aspect of video is tracking a person from frame to frame, person or an object. It's a fundamental operation, right? It's like joining two tables. Or if I look at genetic data, seeing how these sequences occur, where they occur, and what their complements are, is a fundamental operation. Or if I look at spatial data, concepts such as proximity is very fundamental. But we have no domain-specific language that captures these kind of elements. And to be a lasting and successful language like SQL, the replacement of SQL or the evolution of SQL needs to capture these operations, but at the same time be generic enough to capture a wider set of data than it is initially intended for. So a very big thing that's coming our way, it's almost a necessity. In other words, data is already there. We just don't have the tools yet, is domain-specific languages. The next important aspect is how we store the data. So there is no single database that can hold visual and oral data alongside of spatial data. You could put it, but working with it becomes very inelegant. Now, if I add something like genetic data, it gets even harder. But the three are very strongly related, right? Because if I look at genetic data, that determines the color of somebody's eyes very strongly. Now, a video captures that aspect of it. You can see the color of somebody's eye in a video. And the spatial aspect of it tells me where the person is. So it is kind of an observer consistency that I spoke about. The visual data, the genetic data, the spatial data may not standalone have a connection. But if I were to observe all three of them in any particular setting, they are indeed connected. And as an observer, I want to make this connection. But there is no database that stores this together. And there is no language for me to operate on them individually. So this is a very big opportunity. And a database that can store varieties of types of data is going to be a requirement to take our data collections that look like this today and organize it into a form that is useful. The final aspect of this that I wanted to call out today is consolidation of data and compute. Humans have a way of looking at complexity. So, when we learned mathematics, we talk about, we learn addition, and then we learn multiplication as a derived aspect of addition. Now, I deal with polynomials, and we teach polynomials as a derived aspect of multiplication, and so on and so forth. So humans deal with complexity by creating layers. But the layers don't exist in the real world. So layers is a tool that we use in human minds to visualize things, but they are not necessarily physical artifacts. And what happens over time is that when we learn a system well and the system becomes commoditized, the layers consolidate. The same layers that helped us understand also start representing boundaries of inefficiency. A very good example is phones and music players. So for a long time, phones and music players were, please give me. Phones and music players were two separate devices, and people carried around two devices, a Palm Pilot and a music player. And these two were separate artifacts that you carried around, and they were different because they were different technologies. Phones had radios and they basically had to have subscriber information, whereas music devices had to do decoding audio, storing a lot of it, and these two aspects were considered different. But once we mastered all of it, they consolidate into a single device. In hindsight, it's obvious. Why would you want to carry around two devices when one could do? Now, GPSs were separate devices than phones. because the complexity of receiving a GPS signal and an antenna took physical space and power. But as it improved, this collapsed again. Now, this same layer consolidation is going to happen between data and compute. Because cloud is complex and we are doing it for the first time, our human minds to deal with complexity have separated out data and computation. A classic example is Amazon. See, if you look at Amazon, compute is captured in a product such as Amazon Lambda, and data is captured in a product such as S3 or EBS or any of these offerings. But they are two separate aspects. It makes sense because when you're dealing with a lot of complexity, it is good to think about them separately. And you have fundamentally different aspects, such as if I do a piece of computation, I can ask the question, is it ephemeral? Does it have a global state? If I look at data, I can ask questions like, does it have acid properties? Is the data that I wrote, is it durable? Has it been replicated? Will it survive a disaster? But as we understand these areas better, these need to come together. And in coming together, we will realize a logical consolidation that has already happened. It's like your music player and your phone coming together. Once it comes together, it just makes sense. So we are on the threshold of that. For us to capture the data that's coming our way, that our new devices, our new sensors are bringing in, and to operate on them, we need the new tools such as DSLs. And when these DSLs come in, you can no longer separate data and compute. A very similar thing happened with programming itself. If you remember, we had languages like C. In C, you had structures and you had functions. You had variables and you had code. And then C++ came. It's probably 10 years, 15 years. 15 years later, it evolved. The main idea that C++ brought to the table is that these are not two artifacts. Code operates on data. You took this thing called a class, which is a collection of code and data, and you had methods which operated on data. It's a simple shift, but it's exactly this. It's a layer consolidation between two separate artifacts in C, which is a very fundamental, groundbreaking language. But C++ put them together because we no longer need to look at them separately. We understand both, and bringing them together gives us flexibilities and expressiveness that make us ready for the next generation of larger amounts of code. Now we are on the threshold of the same thing happening between data and compute. Things like the actor model have been around for a long time, but the notion that data and compute are separate is going to go away, and they're going to come together. And there are vast amounts of opportunities to make it happen. I'd like to give a shout out. There's some excellent work being done at PES Cloud and Big Data Center. There's also excellent work in places like Couchbase India being done on it. We are actively working on data and computation. And to folks in universities who will soon be looking at the world and how you can change it in a commercial setting, there is venture capital. It's a blessing we have today that equips us with abilities to do things that fundamentally change the world at a scale that we could not do before. But these are the tools that are available to you folks. You are at the borderline of a significant transition. It's an order of magnitude larger than the transition from databases to from relational algebra to databases, and from databases to NoSQL or big data. We are about to witness a similar transition forward that brings things like time series data and visual data together, and a domain specific language that can work on it. And you will see a layer consolidation between data and compute. It's happening. It's very obvious, but we don't have the tools for it. There's an enormous opportunity that's available to you to capture and make things happen. And it's a time that we look back and say was very fundamental and formative of data as a space. But we are here today. It's a very exciting time, and do think about where this is going and what role you can play in it. Thank you very much, folks. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sriram. That was a great talk.
Thank you, Sriram.
Thank you very much.
Excellent talk. You touched upon history of data evolution, databases evolution, differences between ACID and sharded databases, and the next big things going to happen. Right. Very, very interesting and insightful talk. I request the participant to post the questions in the questions box for Sriram. While they post the questions, I have a couple of questions, Sriram. You said that the consolidation of the data and compute, right? There were attempts before, right? And I have seen the number of appliance models, okay, from various organizations, okay, where they created these appliances to combine the data and compute capabilities to process specific data very well, right? So what is your view on how it is going to happen in the future? Those kind of appliance models on the cloud, do you think that is a practical thing going to happen, or a different way of consolidating the data and compute to emerge?
It's a very interesting question, sir, that you ask. And I think a lot of ideas need their time to come. Something that I'm constantly reminded of is Apple had made this product called Apple Newton very long time ago. It kind of had the elements of what we have today in our smartphones, but it was much earlier, 20, 30 earlier, 30 years before, and probably a good 15 years before smartphone came about. And it was a failure. It had a lot of promise, but it failed. Yeah, and if we look at NoSQL databases, there was a previous generation of databases, document databases, that came and didn't take off. So I completely agree with you that the idea is old. As long as we have separated, we have also been trying to combine it. But I think they have not succeeded because the time wasn't right yet. One good example I want to give is relational databases have this notion of triggers. I write this code in PL SQL and it runs when something happens to data. It has been around for a long time, and in not too distant past, there are significant applications developed using triggers alone. And that basically became a bottleneck because the databases was one piece of infrastructure. It was one box. And this one box was serving a lot of clients. As the number of clients increased, the database became a point of contention. And more code, more logic you wrote into database, the database got that much slower. So while triggers were very popular and people wrote a lot of code, Oracle Forms is a good example. It fell out of favor because it did not perform well. With 10 connected users, great. 20, great. But when we went to internet scale of things, where we had 2,000 users operating simultaneously or 20,000 users, it quickly became unviable. So triggers is an example of what you said, sir, which is that it was an idea that existed, it had been tried out, and it failed. But if I look at databases today, what has changed is that database is no longer one box. A database has become a cluster, and this cluster can be scaled. I can add more nodes. I can have hundreds of nodes in a cluster. So the reasons why we moved away from database, which is scalability issues, are actually not there anymore. So I can add more nodes to a cluster and make it work better. Now, if I look at what replaced these triggers, the two-tier architecture where you had the client and database, the three-tier architecture we brought in had the database, we had the app server, and then we had the client. And app servers essentially represented a scaling layer. So you had database which could not scale, but it held the global state. And then you had app servers which could do linear scaling. And then you had the clients consuming the data. But it is my argument that the three-tier architecture's time has come. because the database itself has linear scalability. It itself has the performance aspects. So perhaps some of the computation that we do in middle tier is now ready to move back into the database. Now, doing that gives us a lot of value because you are not moving data from one computer to another to operate on it and writing it back into the database. You get a boost in performance that you could not have had before. I think of it as, if you are interested in researching a topic, do you go to the library or do you have books mailed to you at home? Both work, but if I look at 3-tier architecture, it is like having books mailed to you at home. You lose the selectivity and you're slower doing it. By taking computation to data, it's like walking into a library, right? Your computation and your information get much closer. It didn't work in the previous era. It worked once and it hit scalability issues. But I strongly feel that now with clustered databases that have linear scalability, perhaps it is time for some of what we have done in 3 tiers to consider moving back to 2 tiers because of the enormous performance benefits that it brings us, which is now a necessity because of the explosion of data that we are seeing. A very interesting observation. I think about it a lot too. And I think the next few years is going to give an answer to us on this.
I think you're on mute, Ram Babu.
Yes, thank you. We have a few more questions from KVS, Shekhar Babu, and
Sridhar.
yes,
And myself as well.
Please go ahead, Gopal.
Okay. So 2 quick questions, Sriram. Great talk. One is more of an immediate view, since there's been a lot of excitement about Snowflake. I wanted to know your view on what is the value and what Snowflake brings to the table in this context of data and cloud. And the other is a more philosophical question, because you are talking about really a database of any perceivable data and domain-specific languages to deal with this. But where this really needs to head, because perception is really, so to speak, in the eyes of the beholder. So it's how do we deal with the explosion we are coming up with, and how can we communicate effectively the summary of data and all that unstructured picture that you showed? How do we communicate that more effectively with humans? Is there a fundamentally different approach we need to take in terms of learning how to communicate that data to humans? So that's a philosophical question.
It's very interesting observation, sir. I actually don't know the answer, but as you said, I recognize that it's very important question, and it's upon us because there is no doubt that the data has already arrived. All the data that we are capturing into the cloud, all the audio that Alexa and other devices are capturing, the data is already there. But as you say, we clearly don't have the tools. We don't even know how to store them together in a consistent way. So the problem exists, it is upon us, and I don't know how we are solving it. But the observation that I want to make today is that we have to solve it because the problem is already upon us. So it's very interesting observation, and it's my observation as well. And I don't know what the solution will be, but I'm very excited that in the next 5 years, we have to find a solution. The tools we have today, like schemas and SQL, aren't going to cut it. We clearly know that, right? Because it's very hard to talk about rotating an image in SQL. You can extend it. Maybe that's the way we'll go. Or maybe somebody will invent a new DSL language. The exciting prospect is it could be us. It could be our generation of our new engineers who are coming out who will make this transition happen. Now, to talk about the first question that you asked, Snowflake, I don't know too much about Snowflake, but I do know that they've had a very successful, financially successful start. And there's another interesting aspect of data. Data is a long-lived artifact. So I learned over my career that, if a company is doing well, it may open new showrooms, it may open new offices. And if it is not doing well, it may shrink its offices, it may shrink its operations. But no company turns off its database. See, if you look at an artifact like a customer list go generations. See, if your parents had a Maruti Suzuki, they would have used it for a significant portion of their driving, but it also has impact on their next generation. If your parents had a Maruti Suzuki, you are more likely to buy a Maruti Suzuki. So now for Maruti Suzuki as a company, their data doesn't live for weeks or months. It lives for generations. And it's an enormously commercially lucrative market. So if you look at Oracle, it's a power of its own, enormously successful, financially successful company. And it's not just an academic pursuit. The explosion of data that we are seeing has significant commercial value. And Snowflake is an illustration of where we could be whenever we move the needle in terms of data and databases. So it's an aspect. That's why I mentioned companies that are working in this space and venture capital, because the commercial impact of this trend and capturing it is enormous. I don't know how we'll capture it. I don't know what are the innovations that will make it happen. But I can tell you that the problem is upon us, and I can tell you we don't have the tools today. So it's an inevitability that we have to develop the tools. And to those who develop it, there is a very significant commercial success awaiting them. Thank you. It's a very, very interesting observation and question. These are the things that I'm very excited to see happen. There's a lot of things that future holds for us that is very exciting.
Thank you.
But Dr. K.V. Subramanian has another question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sriram. Interesting talk. So one of the points that you kind of raised was trying to move the computation, reduce from 3 tiers to 2 tiers. So I was trying to take that a little further to ask that with the advent of 3D memories and the fact that you need to move all this data from memory DRAM into CPU for processing, there's also the possibility that you can now do computation on the memory itself. Do you see databases moving in that direction of doing their query processing in memory? Any work in Couchbase on that?
Absolutely, sir. So I'm actually even more stronger on that. I'm saying that it has to move into the kind of things that you talk about. So 3D memory, non-volatile memory, basically turns a lot of things that we have learned, like layered storage or doing persistence or doing garbage collection or doing block writes, around the head. It's like we have learned how to walk, but we suddenly find ourselves in water. It's a new area, and we have no idea how to deal with it, but we have to deal with it. And 3D Xpoint is one of those fundamental transitions that's happening today. And what I see is that because of the way hardware has changed, hardware has always traditionally been ahead of software. Software has to play catch up now. Now, to me, the 2-tier versus 3-tier is a larger problem, in the sense that to move within one computer is less of a problem than moving between computers over a network. The bandwidth that we have between the memory bus and the CPU is much faster than the bandwidth we have between one compute node and another compute node. But today, if I look at a lot of cloud architectures, we separate data and compute using network. So if I have S3 or if I have EBS, and if I have a compute element like Lambda, they interact over network abstractions. It's inefficient. It gives us the clean separation, so we can reason with them separately, we can build them separately, and we can model and we can develop software separately. It's a very important tool, but it's a tool for the human mind. It's for humans to work more efficiently. It's not for hardware to work more efficiently. As you pointed out, sir, with NVRAM, with non-volatile RAM, 3D Xpoint, it's a matter of time before it completely changes things. I'll give an example. So when I was in college and I was studying databases, it was very important to optimize sector access, because hard disk, the storage, they had heads that moved on a platter, and you had to put things in serial order, otherwise your throughput would be very low. Now flash memory came and fundamentally changed it, and honestly, databases are still catching up to it. Even though the transition from spinning disk to flash happened probably a decade ago, database software is finally now beginning to embrace flash, where you no longer have this kind of mechanical aspects to data access, but you can do like block access equally well. And you have a different set of problems, such as your erase block, which is much bigger than your accessible read block. So databases are catching up to it. And now we have 3D Xpoint. It's a fundamental change where data is no longer, where RAM is no longer volatile. And you really have no need to distinguish between writing to a disk versus writing to a RAM. And in fact, 3D Xpoint achieves densities which are significantly higher than RAM. So they can not only hold data durably, but they can do so with much higher densities than our flash RAM can do today. And the change is already on us. At Couchbase, I have spoken a number of times to the folks at Intel and Micron, and it's very interesting, right? And there's a lot of academic publications about this concept of many years ago called transactional memory, where you look at writing to memory as a transaction, is now a necessary aspect. If you are going to work with 3D Xpoint and you are going to work with it efficiently, you have to treat memory as transactional object. So it's very interesting, and I think there is no doubt that software that works with data, which I claim is all of cloud, has to move to the next generation. And the hardware is upon us, the explosion of data is upon us. So I think the thing that remains is for people to move forward. It's a very interesting time, and a lot of times the mathematics of these have done many years ago, even before any of the technologies came. If you look at relational algebra, you look at De Morgan's publications, they happened, in an era long before computers came along. Computers just unlocked that mathematical aspect that has existed for a very long time. So to me, 3D Xpoint is one of those. It brings this idea of transactional memory that had been studied and analyzed many years ago into the domain of reality. It's a very exciting concept, and I'm looking forward to actually working with 3D Xpoint devices. I think Intel says that they are going to be ready to ship prototypes. I think Optane is actually commercially available, and it is indeed an area where I hope Couchbase is going to take significant leadership.
Okay. Dr. Sagar Babu has a question. Dr. Sagar Babu, you want to go ahead?
Thanks, Mr. Ram Babu. Mr. Sriram, excellent talk, as Dr. Gopal said, and wonderful point on the consolidation of data and compute, and especially on the compute. I think one piece which I was going to ask, and Professor KV has already asked, related to the memory part of it. I was going to, I mean, you beautifully put the whole evolution of 40-50 years. But on the computing side, I strongly believe, the way Professor KV has also mentioned about the memory piece of it. I think the other resource in the computing side, which I believe should be evolving, is the is from the processing side, processor side, and not pure hardware processor. I think it has to be in some way a software defined thing, because as you already nailed it right, saying hardware makes leaps from inventions or innovations, but then databases is yet to catch up to that. So again, that is the same bottleneck that's going to come even if the hardware catches up, unless that there is a software with, or the tools. In this case, I'm calling it software, but it's actually a tool. So there has to be that evolution. So in any insights from your standpoint on this point that I mentioned?
The one insight I have, Dr. Babu, is that to me, when I was graduating, multi-core and multi-threaded programming, we used to call it as distributed computing or multi-core computing. Yep. It was kind of it was a specialized area. But now today, if I talk to somebody who graduated from college and doesn't know how to deal with 20 cores, it's basically, like somebody who can't program. So I think things like atomic clocks or understanding how cached lines work or thread synchronization are no longer niche topics. It's become a necessary basic aspect of one's reporter. And you are right, sir. I think the same thing has to happen again, because now we have gone from cores to many of them. And if we look at GPUs, it's very interesting because you have thousands of cores, and while these cores could do only simple operations in the past, they're evolving quickly. I think Intel just announced their Z architecture, and they have in the past tried to make the computes more generic. So it might be the next step in GPU-based computing. But I think if we look at our programming languages, it's very hard to parallelize them, or it's very hard to express how to use a massive cluster of CPUs like GPUs bring. And programming them today is a specialized skill. Like concurrent programming used to be a while back. So I definitely agree. I think software has to move forward. And I think processors are changing significantly. I think they're hitting the limits of what they can do in a single core. I just saw that Intel moved, Taiwan Semiconductor moved to 5 nanometer node. It's incredible because at one point, 5 nanometers was saying that's the limit. You can't go below that because of quantum effects.
Correct.
But it's amazing to see that, the new generation of iPhones are shipping and they're using 5 nanometers. And I think software really has to keep up with that. See, there's augmented reality that's now viable. But I think because software involves humans and humans are a scarce supply, it is the bottleneck. And to make the scarce supply of humans more efficient, we need tools. So I think the tool builders of this generation have a significant challenge on their hands. As you mentioned, how do we deal with the hardware? How do we deal with processors that are now going from 1 core, 2 cores to thousands of cores? How do we deal with 3D Xpoint, which is non-volatile RAM? If I put a computer, I can do this commercially today for probably under 1 lakh rupees. I can take Optane and I can take a NVIDIA CUDA card and put them together. I have a beast that none of us understand, sir, because it has 1,000 cores and it has RAM that is durable. And the fundamental ways we look at computing has changed it also. We have hardware today available commercially. We have no idea how to use them, and we have no tools to deal with it. And it represents an enormous opportunity. I absolutely agree. I think processors have undergone a fundamental change, and we have to tool up to make it work for us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Hi, Sriram. Sridhar here. Very good presentation. Very insightful. Thank you. I have two questions. One is curious to know what are the advantages Couchbase offers in the data processing. That is one question. And the second one is the basic information, like sort of question, where SQL, non-SQL databases are there, right? is there any advantage of non-SQL databases dealing with the new kind of operations? We are talking about some of the operations you told, like tree falling and that space sort of thing, right? So any non-SQL brings any advantage over the SQL in addressing such data operations is the second question.
Sure, absolutely. I'll go in the reverse order. To me, the NoSQL moment is fundamentally about changing the cost value proposition. As a programmer, to me, the ACID databases are much more preferable to the weaker consistency models of sharded databases. Purely as a programmer, I like durability. If I ask database to write something, I want it to be there forever. I don't want to deal with the aspect of did it replicate, can it be lost? And I don't want to deal with inconsistency. So if I wrote A, I read A and wrote B, I don't want somebody to see B but not A. So the ACID databases represent a higher level of guarantees, and we already have it. But the reason why NoSQL databases came about, and the evolution is very interesting because we have giants like Microsoft and Oracle who have the best minds in the database industry for the last 30-40 years. They have enormous profits to back this up, and yet the NoSQL databases happen. It's unthinkable given the resources and given the intelligence that the relational companies have, that NoSQL movement could happen. NoSQL movement happened, in my view, because of the fundamental aspect that relational databases capture tabular data. See, relational databases came from a time when you had accounting books and they needed to become electronic. And they did that. And ACID properties and other things that came about were necessary artifacts. Now, when I look at NoSQL databases and Couchbase in specific, one of the key aspects of Couchbase is that it has no schema. So when I work with a relational database, I have to tell upfront saying this is the shape of data. Every object in a table has to look exactly the same. It's very useful model because when I write code, the code embodies such assumptions, but it doesn't work with the real world. See, if I take any aspect of real world, right? I stand at a gate. It might be that 9 out of 10 things that come through the gate might be people. But, once in a while a dog will appear. Now, if I say that all the entries in a gate is a table, and I put down things like name and I put down Aadhaar number, and a dog walks in through the gate, I now have a choice to make. I can either keep my table with my Aadhaar numbers and names, and then I can ignore the fact that a dog walked in, or now I can extend my schema to say whether it was a human or animal, which is very disruptive. So when I look at Oracle versus Couchbase, this is the transition that these products fundamentally bring. When I program with Couchbase, I no longer have to decide upfront what shape of data is going into the product, into the database. I can add people, but when I see a dog walk in for the first time, the system does not prohibit me from recording that a dog walked in. Now, when I write code against it, I have to be aware of it. So if I've written code that assumes people are humans and looks for other numbers, it will not work with the document. So that aspect fundamentally remains, but on the capture side, we have enabled it to capture the wide variety of data. And these products work well just because the real world is like that. The real world is not atomic. I'll tell you why. So let's say that we agreed to meet for coffee, but at the same time, Dr. Babu and Dr. KVS agreed to meet for lunch. These are two fundamental aspects. They happened at the same point in time, in the same places, and we all know each other. But whether we agreed to meet for breakfast first or whether they agreed to meet for lunch first is irrelevant. Now, a relational database trying to model the absolute world with absolute serial ordering is basically imposing these kind of constraints, like saying everyone goes through the gate is a human, or that we have total ordering, or even acyclic ordering, which is just not fundamental to the world. I have no idea what's happening with my sister who is in a different continent. It's important, it's irrelevant, but I don't know until I observe. So now a system that captures both continents is useful, but that's not how the real world works. And to me, these are the fundamental aspects that allowed NoSQL databases to come into existence. And if I had to summarize my response to your very interesting observation in one sentence, I would say it like this. Earlier, we thought data was something, like it was some subsection of facts. Now data is much bigger. So for the subset that was captured by relational databases are still absolutely the best fit. But today we are capturing a much broader set of data. And for this, the NoSQL databases are the right fit. And it is my belief that the data that we are capturing has already exploded. So there's another generation, like we went from relational to NoSQL. There is another generation of databases that are due, and they don't exist today. And I'm really looking forward for them to come.
Thank you, Sriram.
Dr. Sanjay, we are behind schedule, but there is one more question. Do we take questions anymore, or Dr. Sanjay, we cannot hear you.
You are on mute. Probably you will take that question offline, Shashi.
Sure.
Sriram, thanks for excellent session. We all very well enjoyed. You brought out the next big things to happen, and very, very insightful session. Thank you for. Sanjay, you want to say a few words?
Sanjay, you're on mute. We can't hear you. Dr. Sanjay, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think there's a problem with the connection, Sanjay. You probably need to sign out and sign back in. This happens sometimes. You probably have to leave and come back. Yeah.
So it's been a very interesting session even for me. We don't often think about things like this. I think conference is a place where one can step back from our daily lives and bugs and projects and code and sessions and think about the bigger picture. So it's been enormously valuable to me, very enjoyable to think about where we are heading. And I think these insights are very valuable because they tell us where we need to go in the long term. And often in the short term, where we are taking small steps, we don't think about the long term. So it's been a very useful opportunity. And I love conferences because they give you the freedom and force you to think about the long term.
Hi, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so that did the trick actually of rejoining. So thank you very much, Sriram. It was really, really insightful.
Thanks.
Started with a lot of philosophical things like what is data, etc. Right? It was really kind of aha moment kind of thing, right? To understand in a really basic level, which really changes the way we treat the data, right? So I'm sure all participants will remember this for a long time and cherish that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
We now end this session and move on to Research Scholar Symposium.